One moment there was only the oppressive silence of the Vietnamese highlands, thick with humidity and the smell of rotting vegetation. The next, the world turned inside out. Mortar shells screamed through the canopy, tearing branches into splinters, sending shockwaves through the red clay earth. The soldier didn't hear the first explosion so much as feel it in his chest. A concussive fist that knocked the air from his lungs and left his ears ringing with a high-pitched whine that wouldn't stop. He was flat against the ground before his mind caught up with his body, face pressed into mud that tasted of iron and decay. Around him the patrol dissolved into chaos. Men scattered, diving behind fallen logs, scrambling for the tree line. The radio man, just 15 feet away, clutched his shoulder where blood was already soaking through his uniform in a spreading dark stain. The lieutenant was yelling orders that nobody could hear over the roar of incoming fire, and then the jungle itself seemed to come alive with muzzle flashes. The soldier's hands moved on instinct, bringing his M16 up, finger finding the trigger. His heart hammered against his ribs so hard he thought it might crack bone. This was it. This was the moment every soldier knew was coming from the instant they stepped off the transport plane into the wall of Vietnamese heat. The moment when training either held or shattered, when you discovered what kind of man you really were. But for the soldier, there had always been two wars. The one in the jungle and the one he'd been fighting since the day he was born. 6 months earlier, the heat had been different. Not the wet, suffocating blanket of Southeast Asia, but the dry, burning kind that rose off the tarmac at Fort Benning in waves that made the air shimmer. The soldier stood in formation with 40 other men, all of them freshly processed, heads shaved, dressed in fatigues so new they still had creases from the package. The drill instructor paced in front of them like a predator selecting prey, and when he reached the soldier, he paused, looked him up and down with eyes that lingered just a fraction too long. The soldier stared straight ahead, jaw tight, knowing what was coming. He'd seen that look his entire life, in the eyes of store clerks who followed him down aisles, in the faces of teachers who called on him last, in the expressions of police officers who pulled over his father for driving through the wrong neighborhood. It was the look that said, "You don't belong here, and we're going to make sure you know it." The instructor leaned in close, breath hot with coffee and cigarettes, and delivered the first cut. Not the last. Never the last. The training itself was designed to strip away everything soft, everything civilian. They ran until men vomited in the Georgia dust. They crawled through mud under barbed wire while machine gun fire cracked overhead. They learned to field strip weapons blindfolded, to fight with bayonets, to survive on 3 hours of sleep and 1 meal a day. The Army wanted to forge them into something harder than the boys who'd arrived on buses from every corner of America. But the soldier learned quickly that the proving grounds were different depending on the color of your skin. When white recruits fell out of a run exhausted, they were given water breaks and second chances. When the soldier slowed, even slightly, the punishments were immediate and creative. Extra push-ups in the sun until his arms trembled. Night watch duties that stole what little sleep they were allowed. Latrine duty with a toothbrush and a bucket. And always, always the comments that cut deeper than any physical pain. The suggestions that he'd be better suited to service roles than combat. The jokes about his people and their supposed natural abilities and inabilities. The constant, grinding message that he was less than, would always be less than, no matter how hard he tried. The soldier absorbed it all in silence. He'd been absorbing it his whole life. Growing up in Mississippi, where drinking fountains were marked with signs he'd learned to read before he learned to tie his shoes. Where his mother cleaned white people's houses and came home too tired to stand, but always made sure he and his sisters had food on the table. Where his father worked 12-hour shifts at the lumber mill and told him, voice heavy with something between warning and resignation, to keep his head down, to be twice as good, to survive by being perfect because perfect was the only language they might understand. So the soldier ran faster, shot straighter, pushed harder than anyone around him, white or black. He made himself flawless because flawlessness was armor, even if it was armor that could be pierced by a single word, a single look, a single reminder that in their eyes he would never be enough. Late at night in the barracks, when the lights were out and men spoke in whispers, the soldier heard them, the white recruits from Alabama and Tennessee and Texas, talking about how the Army was going soft, letting in anyone these days. How Vietnam would be good because at least over there they could fight a real enemy instead of dealing with people who didn't deserve to wear the uniform. The soldier lay in his bunk and stared at the ceiling, listening, feeling each word land like a fist to the gut. His bunkmate, another black recruit from Detroit, would sometimes catch his eye in the darkness, and they'd share a look that said everything that couldn't be spoken aloud. That said, "We're alone here, even surrounded by dozens of men." 3 weeks before graduation, during a live-fire exercise, someone fired live rounds instead of blanks. The bullet snapped past the soldier's head close enough that he felt the pressure wave against his cheek. He dropped and rolled, heart exploding into his throat, brains screaming that this was wrong. This wasn't supposed to happen. The investigation later called it an accident, a clerical error. These things happen. But the soldier had seen the face of the recruit who'd fired, seen the cold calculation in his eyes, and he knew. Someone had tried to kill him during training, and the system had shrugged it off as an unfortunate mistake. That night he sat on his bunk and wrote a letter home. His mother wrote back 2 weeks later, her handwriting shaky but determined, the product of a woman who'd taught herself to read at age 30 using her children's school books. She wrote about his sisters, about church, about the garden she was trying to keep alive in the Mississippi heat, and then at the end she wrote something that made him fold the letter carefully and tuck it into his pocket, where he'd carry it across an ocean and into the jungle. She told him to remember who he was, that he wasn't fighting for the people who hated him, that he was fighting because he was a man, and a man does what's right even when the world is wrong, that he should come home safe, that they loved him more than all the hate in the world could ever measure. The soldier carried those words with him onto the transport plane that flew them to Vietnam, carried them through the smell of fuel and sweat and fear, carried them as 100 young men, most of them barely old enough to drink legally, flew toward a war that television had turned into a nightly ritual in American living rooms. They tried to sleep, they tried to joke, they tried to pretend they weren't terrified. The soldier sat between his bunkmate from Detroit and a white kid from Ohio who'd been decent to him during training, and he wondered if shared danger might forge a brotherhood that transcended the divisions of home. He wanted to believe it, but he'd learned early that hope was a luxury that could get you hurt. They landed at Tan Son Nut Air Base outside Saigon just after dawn. The heat hit them like a physical force when the transport door opened, different from Georgia, from Mississippi, from anywhere the soldier had ever been. This heat was alive, thick with moisture and smells he couldn't identify, jet fuel and incense, cooking fires and human waste. The sweet rot of vegetation and something else underneath it all, metallic and organic, that he'd later learn was the smell of a country at war with itself. The soldiers' unit was deployed to the Central Highlands, a region of mountains and jungle where the enemy moved like ghosts through terrain that fought against American troops every step of the way. They flew in on helicopters, the doors opened so you could see the jungle rushing past below, an endless green carpet that hid everything. Their base was a fire base carved out of the wilderness, surrounded by sandbags and concertina wire, guard towers, bunkers, a landing pad for helicopters that came and went at all hours. It was supposed to be secure, but everyone knew that secure was relative in Vietnam. The racism didn't disappear in the war zone. If anything, it crystallized into something more dangerous. Some of the white soldiers self-segregated, sitting together in the mess hall, bunking together when they could, making it clear through 1,000 small gestures that they didn't consider the black soldiers fully part of the unit. Others were better, professional enough to work together in the field, even if they'd never share a beer in the rear. But the worst were the ones who brought the full weight of their prejudice into the war zone, who saw the jungle as a place where accidents could happen and questions wouldn't be asked too carefully. There was a sergeant who made his feelings clear through assignment of the worst details. Point duty on patrols. Last watch before dawn when exhaustion made you sloppy. Anything involving the shit-burning detail. He cornered the soldier one morning after a mission briefing, stood too close in a way that was clearly intentional, and delivered what wasn't quite a threat but wasn't not a threat either. Out in the jungle, he made clear bodies had a funny way of not making it home. Friendly fire, confusion in a firefight, the wrong person in the wrong place when the bullets started flying. The soldier walked out into the burning sunlight and felt something harden inside him. He'd spent his whole life swallowing rage, turning it inward, using it as fuel to push harder and prove himself. But here in this place where death was casual and justice was whatever the men with rank decided it was, he realized that being good might not be enough, that survival might require something else entirely. That night, sitting alone on the edge of a bunker and staring out at the jungle, the soldier made a decision. He would be the best soldier in the unit, not for recognition, not for approval, but because excellence was the only protection he had. Because if he was good enough, valuable enough, essential enough, they would need him alive more than they wanted him dead. The patrols were the worst part. Walking through the jungle for hours, every sense on high alert, knowing that the next step might trigger a punji pit or a pressure mine, that the tree line ahead might erupt with automatic weapons fire, that the trail you were following might lead straight into an ambush. The soldier learned to read the jungle the way he'd learned to read the faces of white people back home, looking for the small tells. The silence of birds that meant someone was nearby, the tripwire glinting in filtered sunlight, the patch of ground that looked just slightly different from the earth around it. He became exceptional at it, his eyes sweeping constantly, catching details that others missed. On his third patrol, he spotted the mine before the point man stepped on it, saw how the dirt had been moved, slightly darker, the pattern of leaves not quite natural. His shout froze the entire column. The lieutenant came forward angry at the unauthorized halt, then went pale when he saw what the soldier had spotted. Chinese-made anti-personnel mine, enough explosive to turn a man into red mist. The demolition specialist disabled it with hands that moved with practiced precision. The point man, standing 3 feet from sudden death, started shaking. Something shifted after that. The soldier had saved lives. White lives. And some of the men who'd been coldly professional before started to look at him differently. Not with warmth necessarily, but with the beginning of trust. They might not like him, but they wanted him close when this shit hit the fan. They were using him, his bunkmate from Detroit pointed out bitterly. They'd take his skills but still wouldn't see him as equal. The soldier didn't argue. He knew it was true. But he'd rather have them use him and stay alive than prove a point and die. The ambush came on a day that started like any other. Monsoon season had begun, turning the trails to mud and the rivers to brown torrents. The patrol splashed through ankle-deep water, clothes never dry, skin wrinkled and raw. They were 5 clicks from base, sweeping a valley that intelligence said was an enemy supply route. The lieutenant was nervous. They all were. The jungle felt wrong, too quiet. Even the insects had gone silent. The soldier felt it in his bones, that electric tension that came before violence. He'd learned to trust that feeling. He slowed his pace, rifle coming up slightly, finger moving to rest against the trigger guard. Around him, others sensed it too. The patrol tightened up, men moving closer together, eyes scanning the tree line. Then the world ended. Automatic weapons fire ripped through the patrol from 3 sides simultaneously. Trees shredded. Men screamed. The soldier hit the ground, rolled, came up firing at muzzle flashes that lit the undergrowth like strobes. Someone behind him took a round and went down hard, gurgling. The radio man clutched his shoulder, blood pumping between his fingers. The lieutenant was yelling coordinates into his handset, calling for fire support, for helicopters, for anything. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere, firing from concealed positions, using the terrain like they'd been born to it. The patrol tried to form a defensive perimeter, but the ground was wrong. All exposed roots and mud that offered no cover. Men scrambled for the tree line. The kid from Ohio, who'd been kind during training, made it 3 steps before a burst of fire caught him across the chest. He dropped like someone had cut his strings, and a picture of his girlfriend fluttered from his hand and landed in the mud. The soldier saw it happen in slow motion. Saw the Ohio kid's face register surprise more than pain. Saw him fall. And something broke open inside the soldier. Not panic. Not fear. Something else. A clarity that cut through the chaos like a blade. He saw the whole battlefield laid out in his mind. Saw where the firing was coming from. Saw the weak point in their position. Saw what needed to happen. He started firing methodical bursts into the tree line, and others joined him, laying down enough fire to suppress one of the ambush positions. Then the soldier moved. Not away from the danger, toward it. He crawled through the mud, bullets snapping overhead toward the radio man. The man's face was gray with shock, hands still clamped over the wound but weakening. If they didn't get him out, he'd bleed out right there. The soldier grabbed him by the webbing and started dragging him backward toward the lieutenant's position. Rounds stitched the ground where they'd been lying seconds before. Something hot creased the soldier's shoulder, a line of fire that made him gasp but didn't slow him down. He pulled the radio man into the slight depression where the lieutenant was crouched with 3 other soldiers, then grabbed the lieutenant by the front of his uniform and pointed to high ground 50 meters away. They needed to move now, fall back to that ridge, get to cover where they could hold until support arrived. The lieutenant's eyes were wide, face locked in the expression of a man realizing that his training hadn't prepared him for this. That real combat was chaos and terror, and nothing made sense. But he nodded and gave the order. Fighting withdrawal to the ridge. Alternate covering fire. They moved as a unit, half firing while half fell back, then switching. It was textbook. It was what they'd trained for. But training hadn't included the mud, the fear, the way your hands shook so hard you could barely change magazines. The way the air smelled like gunpowder and blood and human shit because someone had been hit in the stomach and their bowels had let go. The soldier moved with the unit, but his eyes never stopped scanning. He saw the enemy fighter moving through the undergrowth, trying to get around their flank. Saw the AK-47 coming up, aiming at his bunkmate's back. The soldier fired first. 3-round burst. Center mass. The fighter went down. His bunkmate never knew how close he'd come to dying. He made it to the ridge and formed a defensive perimeter. The enemy fire slackened as the Americans reached better ground. The soldier checked his ammunition. 3 magazines left. He looked around at the men with him. The lieutenant. His bunkmate. The radio man now being worked on by the medic. 2 other soldiers, both looking shell-shocked but functional. And then the soldier looked back down into the valley. He could see bodies. Couldn't tell from here who was dead and who was wounded. The Ohio kid wasn't moving. Neither were 2 others. But some of them might still be alive. Might be lying there wondering if anyone was coming for them. The lieutenant was already shaking his head before the soldier even spoke. Too dangerous. They'd be cut to pieces. The men down there were dead or would be soon. The retreat was the smart move. Some casualties were acceptable. The soldier met his eyes and saw the calculation happening. Saw the lieutenant weighing the value of men's lives against the risk of losing more. The soldier thought about the Ohio kid who'd been decent when he didn't have to be. About the promise he'd made to himself to be the kind of man who did what was right even when the world was wrong. About his mother's letter in his pocket. He started down the slope without waiting for permission. Behind him, he heard footsteps. His bunkmate was following, and then another soldier. And another. Half the defensive perimeter broke to follow the soldier back into the valley, back toward the ambush site, back toward men who needed them. The enemy was still there, still firing sporadically, but the soldier moved like he was in a dream. Fear had burned away, leaving only purpose. He reached the Ohio kid first. No pulse. The picture of the girlfriend was still there in the mud. The soldier picked it up, tucked it into his pocket, and moved on. The next man was alive. Gut shot, delirious with pain, but alive. The soldier got him up, half carrying him, while his bunkmate appeared and supported the wounded man's other side. They moved back toward the ridge under fire, legs burning, lungs screaming, every step an eternity. 3 more times they went down. 3 more times they brought men back. 1 was already dead. 2 were wounded but would make it if they got to a hospital. By the time they'd recovered everyone, the soldier's uniform was soaked with other men's blood and his own. The crease on his shoulder had opened wider, bleeding steadily. His legs shook with exhaustion. His ears rang with tonights that would never fully go away. The helicopters came in with door guns blazing, laying down suppressing fire. They loaded the wounded first, then the dead. The soldier was last aboard, making sure everyone else was on before he climbed up. As the helicopter lifted off, he looked back at the valley, at the jungle that had tried to kill them all, at the place where the Ohio kid had died. The door gunner, a white guy from Texas who'd never spoken to the soldier before, leaned over and shouted above the rotor noise that the soldier had saved a lot of lives today. A lot of lives. The soldier nodded but didn't respond. He was too tired. Too wrung out of... He closed his eyes and leaned back against the metal hull of the helicopter, feeling the vibration through his whole body, and thought about his mother's letter. About being a man in a wrong world. About doing what was right anyway. The fire base was chaos when they landed. Medics running. Officers shouting. The wounded were triaged and evacuated to the rear. The dead were covered with ponchos and laid out in a row. The soldier refused medical attention until the medic literally grabbed him and forced him to sit down, muttering about idiots who didn't know when they were bleeding. That night the lieutenant came to find the soldier in his hoach. The soldier was lying on his bunk, staring at nothing, replaying the ambush in his mind. The Ohio kid falling, the screaming, the smell. He didn't know if he'd ever sleep again without seeing it. The lieutenant stood in the doorway looking uncomfortable, like he was about to do something that didn't come naturally. He said he owed the soldier an apology, that when the soldier had said he was going back down into the valley, the lieutenant had thought he was crazy, thought he was going to get himself killed for nothing, that he should have trusted the soldier's judgment, that what the soldier had done was beyond brave, was the best soldiering he'd ever seen. He was putting the soldier in for a Bronze Star. The soldier didn't know what to say. A medal seemed meaningless compared to the Ohio kid's death, to the fact that men had died while he'd lived. But he nodded his thanks. After the lieutenant left, the soldier's bunkmate came in, sat down on the bunk across from him. They didn't speak for a long time. Just sat there in the quiet of the hoach, listening to the distant sound of artillery and the closer sound of men trying to process trauma through whatever means they could find. Finally, the bunkmate spoke, voice bitter with exhaustion and disillusionment. He talked about how they'd saved those men, risked everything, and when they got home, if they got home, they'd still be second-class citizens, still get called boy, still have to sit in the back of the bus in some places. They could die for this country, but couldn't drink from the same water fountain in Mississippi. The moral contradiction of it all. Fighting for a country that had never fully claimed them as its own. The soldier thought about that, about wearing the uniform of an army that still saw his skin before it saw his courage. About the question his bunkmate was really asking, why'd you go back down there? Why risk your life for men who probably still think you're less than them? The soldier was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady. He said that those men down there hadn't been asking him what color he was. They'd just been asking him to help, and he'd learned a long time ago that being a man meant you helped when you could, even if the people you were helping didn't deserve it, even if they'd never thank you properly, even if the world was so twisted up that doing the right thing felt like a joke. They didn't do it for recognition, he told his bunkmate. They did it because of who they were, because they were better than the hate. Because someday, maybe not today, maybe not even in their lifetimes, but someday people would look back and see what they did. And maybe then they'd understand that courage doesn't have a color. That brotherhood doesn't have a color. That being a man, a real man, is about how you act when everything's on the line. Outside, someone started playing music. Jimi Hendrix, all along the watchtower. The sound drifted through the hot night air, mixing with the jungle sounds, with the sound of men trying to hold on to their humanity in a place designed to strip it away. The soldier served 8 more months in Vietnam. He went on dozens of patrols, survived 3 more ambushes, saved more lives, lost friends, saw things that would wake him up screaming for decades. The Bronze Star came through along with a field promotion. Men who'd never spoken to him before started seeking his advice. The racist sergeant got transferred out. But the war didn't change. It just ground on, consuming young men and spitting them out, achieving nothing that anyone could clearly define. The soldier stopped trying to understand the larger purpose. He focused on the smaller one, keeping his men alive, getting through each day, counting down the days until his rotation ended and he could go home. When the day finally came, when he boarded the freedom bird that would carry him back to the world, he felt nothing like relief, just exhaustion and a profound sense of dislocation. He was leaving men behind who'd trusted him, who would keep fighting and dying in the jungle while he went home to try to rebuild a normal life. The flight back was nothing like the flight over. No jokes, no bravado, just men staring into space, locked inside their own heads, trying to process what they'd seen and done. The soldier sat by the window and watched Vietnam disappear beneath the clouds. He thought about the Ohio kid's girlfriend, whose picture he still carried. He'd mail it to her when he got home. Maybe write a letter explaining that her boyfriend had been brave, that he'd died quickly, that his last thoughts had been of her. It would all be lies, but they were the kind of lies that help people sleep at night. America looked strange when they landed. Too clean, too bright, too normal. People went about their business like there wasn't a war on the other side of the world, like young men weren't dying in mud and blood and fire. The soldier wanted to shake them, to make them understand, but he knew he couldn't. There was no bridge between what he'd seen and what they knew. He was home, but he'd never really be home again. His family met him at the airport. His mother cried and held him like she'd never let go. His sisters hugged him. His father shook his hand and said, voice thick with emotion, that they were proud of him. But the soldier saw the way other people looked at them. The black family reuniting with their son in his army uniform. Some people smiled. Others looked away, and a few looked at him with open contempt. The uniform didn't protect him from that. Nothing did. He thought about the men he'd saved. Wondered where they were now. Wondered if they'd gone home to parades and gratitude, or if they'd been forgotten too. Wondered if they ever thought about the black soldier who'd risked his life to save theirs. If they told their families that story. If they understood, really understood what it meant. He didn't expect gratitude. He'd stopped expecting that a long time ago. But he hoped in some quiet corner of his heart that maybe he'd change something, that maybe 1 or 2 of those men he'd saved would remember, would raise their children differently, would speak up when they heard racist jokes, would see black people as people, not as a color. It was a small hope, but it was what he had. Years later, the soldier would try to explain it to his own son, try to put words to the contradiction of it all. Fighting for a country that didn't fight for you. Serving with honor in an army that didn't always honor you back. Saving lives that society valued more than your own. His son asked him why he'd done it. Why he'd gone to Vietnam when he could have resisted, could have said no. The soldier thought about all the reasons, about duty and manhood in his mother's letter, about proving something to himself even if he couldn't prove it to the world, about the Ohio kid and his bunkmate and all the others who'd worn the uniform and fought the same 2 wars he'd fought. He told his son that he'd gone because he was an American, even when America didn't want to claim him as one. Even when it hurt. Americans serve, he said. They serve even when it's hard. Even when it's unfair. They serve because that's who they are, and no one can take that away from them. His son asked if it had changed anything. The soldier didn't know. Maybe someone he'd saved went home and raised their kids to be better. Maybe someone saw what he did and realized that skin color doesn't mean a damn thing when the bullets are flying. Maybe he'd just survived and come home and that was enough, or maybe it had changed him, made him understand that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about being terrified and doing what's right anyway. About looking at a world that hates you and deciding you're going to be better than that hate. His son asked if it had been worth it. The soldier looked at him, at the life he'd built despite the nightmares, despite the racism that still followed him, despite everything. He thought about the men who didn't make it home, about the Ohio kid, about his bunkmate, who'd come home and been killed 2 years later by a police officer who claimed he'd feared for his life, about all the black soldiers who'd served with honor and died in anonymity. He said he didn't know if it had been worth it, but he knew he'd done what he had to do. He knew he'd been a man when it mattered, and he knew that history would remember them even if no one wanted to write it down. They were there. They fought. They bled. They saved lives. And no one could take that truth away from them, no matter how hard they tried to forget. The jungle still comes to him sometimes in dreams. The heat, the mud, the sound of helicopters, the Ohio kid falling, the weight of other men's lives in his hands. He wakes up sweating, heart pounding, and for a moment he's back there in the valley, making the choice to go down instead of staying safe. He doesn't regret it. He regrets the war, regrets the waste, regrets the men who died for nothing he could ever understand. But he doesn't regret going back down that slope. Doesn't regret choosing to be the kind of man his mother raised him to be. Because in the end, that's all any of us have. The choices we make when no one's watching. The courage we show when it would be easier to look away. The way we treat each other when the world says we don't have to care. The soldier fought 2 wars in Vietnam. One against an enemy in the jungle. One against an enemy inside his own uniform. He survived both. But the second one never really ended. It followed him home. Followed him through life. Follows him still. But he's still here, still standing, still fighting in his own way by living well, by raising his children right, by refusing to let hate win. That's the real courage, not just the moment under fire, not just the rescue in the valley, but the decades of quiet dignity afterward, the refusal to become what they said he was, the insistence on his own humanity in the face of everything designed to deny it. That's the story they don't tell. That's the war that doesn't get documented. That's the heroism that goes unrecognized. But it happened. He knows it happened. And someday, somehow, the truth will be told. The soldiers who fought 2 wars will be remembered not just for their courage in combat, but for their courage in life. For being better than the hate. For saving lives even when their own weren't valued. For serving with honor when honor wasn't returned. They were there, in the jungles of Vietnam, in the mud and blood and fire. They were there, and they were heroes, even if no one wanted to call them that. The soldier knows. He was there. He remembers. And as long as he's alive, as long as he can speak, he'll make sure others remember too. That's the promise he made to the men who didn't come home, to his bunkmate, to the Ohio kid, to all the others whose names are on a wall in Washington but whose stories are still waiting to be told. He'll remember. He'll speak. He'll bear witness. Because that's what soldiers do. They serve, they fight, they sacrifice. And when they come home, they carry the truth with them, heavy as a rucksack, precious as life itself. They carry it until someone's ready to listen.